Okay, so effective instruction for history, social science. So, effective instruction in history, social science. So, I'm kind of going over Jim Burke's 10 strategies to effective instruction. So, the first one he goes over is vary your instructional methods and strategies. So, in history, social science specifically, it's really important to constantly switch it up. You're covering so much content and material and information that it's important to use different things so that way it's more memorable. So use videos, lectures, PowerPoints, activities, group work, partner work. So that way students aren't coming to class thinking they're going to have to take notes on World War II every single day. Number two, teach students how to think, how to learn, and how to remember. So you can't just sit there and give students the answers and then expect them to understand it and remember it. For example, I had assigned students an assignment to where they had to use a secondary source book other than their textbook, and they had to read the chapters that I assigned, and they had skeleton notes that went along with it. Well, the skeleton notes they were not word for word from the book, so students actually had to read the chapter and actually understand what they were reading so that way they can plug it in properly to the skeleton notes. And they actually got really frustrated with it and actually argued with me saying that it's not word for word. So if I gave it to them word for word, they wouldn't really be learning. They would just be copying. So it's really important that you're teaching them more rigorous stuff. So number three, assess understanding and use the results to improve your teaching. So constantly ask students if they understand. I constantly do that, but kids can constantly show a thumbs up that they understand, but not really understand. So when students are released from my instruction, I'm constantly walking around and observing every kid, asking them, are you okay with what you're learning? What are you needing help on anything? Show me what you've done so far. What are you working on? I'm constantly checking to make sure they're on task, they're understanding what is needing to get done and what they needed to be learned. So number four, use the right tools and technology to enhance instruction. So I actually have access to lots of books, computers, an overhead projector, a smart whiteboard, online resources. So every student has their own computer, internet. So I'm constantly trying to incorporate all of this to make sure my instruction is enhanced as possible. Number five, support all students to ensure success. So design instruction so that is efficient for all students. I show a lot of documentaries, and especially since we're in World War II right now, some of them are in German or German comes up in them. And it's important that there's subtitles so that way students understand what is being said, because the majority of class does not know German, I'm sure. So it's ensuring for success by providing supports like subtitles, etc. So number six, maintain a safe, productive learning environment. So this is always important to be aware of what's going on in your classroom. This is especially with phones and stuff. You want to make sure that students are being productive and learning. Number seven, teach skills and knowledge in context. Especially with history, social science, there's just so much content that you have to go over in a semester, in a whole year. So it's important that teachers chunk the information. So break it down into parts to make it more relevant and understandable. Number eight, organize your instruction around big ideas and essential questions. So especially with history, social science, we even have on our lesson plan the inquiry-based lesson plan. So have an inquiry-based question for your lesson plan sequence or your unit. So right now I'm on, and this needs to focus on big ideas rather than specific details or specific like tedious things in history. So right now we're in World War II. So our inquiry-based question is when is war ever justified? So number nine, help students make connections. So also with history, because there is so much material, like I said, it's so important to constantly make connections to students' personal lives and their experiences so that way they can remember and relate more to what they're learning. We just covered the unit totalitarianism, and a big part of that is censorship done by the government. So I asked students, when have you seen censorship? And everybody said, oh, well, like bad words are bleated out on the radio. I was like, okay, well, that's one example. Where else? And so it actually even came down into where Snapchat has these Daily Mail things. I don't know exactly what it is, but some of the videos on that site are blurred out because of censorship. So it was making personal connections. And then lastly, 10, design lessons and units for maximum learning and engagement. So I always focus on how to make my lesson as engaging as possible. So right now, like I said, we are on World War II. I've given them a lot more opportunity to work together, so that way they're a little bit more engaged. And also, even just from last unit, our review game, instead of just giving them a study guide to review, I actually came up with a game where everybody got to participate in class, and I gave out candy at the end, so it was more engaging. They wanted to win the candy, so it was really fun. Moving on, so instructional sequencing. So number one is focus on desired outcomes when designing instructional sequencing. So this is where backwards planning comes into take. So you want to focus on what you want your kids to learn. You want to know what they want to know. So that leads to the second one, align your instruction and assessment with the appropriate standards. So the standards is what students need to be learning. So by understanding what standards you need to cover helps you focus on what the desired outcomes are, and you can go from there. Number three, create lessons that will motivate and engage all students. So like I said, be creative. Right now we're doing beginning of World War II, so we're doing a timeline. We just got done with a timeline activity, and we actually did this timeline activity using Preston.com rather than students having to write out a boring timeline activity on a graphic organizer. So it made it more engaging and more fun, motivate them to do it. And then 4, always teach for understanding. So teach students to understand the material you're giving, not just memorizing. Like I said, for like vocabulary, which is huge in history, social science, instead of them just copying information like the definitions out of the book, you need to make sure they're understanding it. So constantly teach for understanding. Moving on, so academic language. So I've listed 4 examples for tools of getting students to use more academic language in the classroom related to history, social science. So one of them is encourage students to read diverse texts. So luckily for history, social science, there's tons and tons of stuff kids could read. So primary sources, secondary sources, books, articles, online magazines, anything. So constantly give them stuff to read. Number 2, implement more oral discussion. So give them opportunities to practice using academic language. So this could be through debate, seminars, even just presentations, even if it's just think, pair, shares. Constantly give them a chance to speak. Number 3 is implement more writing. So I know everybody thinks writing should be stuck to ELA. Well, that is not the case, especially history, social science. They should be doing lots of writing, lots of reading. That's a huge thing I've noticed from my supervisor saying and other teachers is incorporate more reading and more writing. So create more writing activities. And another one is dynamically introduce academic vocabulary. So how I introduce academic vocabulary is that they're not allowed to copy the definition straight out of the glossary. They have to come up with their own way, or their own in their own words, the definition of, or meaning of what they think the word is. So that way, by doing that, they're able to understand it more, and that way when someone understands a word more, they can then apply it to their writing, to oral discussion, etc. So differentiating instruction and scaffolding. So how I define differentiating instruction is pretty much means teachers tailoring instruction to meet individual needs, and this is different. Teachers differentiate content, process, products, or the learning environment. The use of ongoing assessment and flexible grouping makes this successful approach to instruction. So that was a definition I kind of found and I liked. So yeah, pretty much teach to meet the needs of all your students, not just some. So how to do that is constantly model and demonstrate. I've learned this the hard way, that if I don't model and demonstrate everything, even if they've done it multiple times, kids will still not understand it. So it will save you a ton of time rather than just explaining it. Still just constantly model and demonstrate what they're doing. Number two, I've actually learned this tip from my guide teacher, is teach the same material in 3 different ways. So what he does when starting a unit, so right now we're doing the beginning of World War II. So we've already taught, so the first part is we have students read the chapter. So, and they use the vocabulary graphic organizer as they're reading through the chapter. So now they've seen the material once about World War II, the beginning. And then next we usually go into a video. So now we're showing a video about pretty much everything they just read. So it's reinforcing what they read, and now they're seeing it in video form. And then 3, we take what they've read and the information they learned from the video and now have them use it in an activity. So for instance, we're doing the timeline activity. So, but they've gotten all the information to complete the timeline activity from the video and from reading the chapter. And then lastly, scaffolding. So I use a lot of scaffolding, I've noticed, because the majority of my class does have IEPs, so I'm constantly having to use things like skeleton notes when doing lecture or watching video. I constantly let them work with a partner because it gives them more freedom, and it also helps them get the help they need when I'm not available, if I'm working with someone else. Also, the graphic organizers, like I said, I'm constantly using them because they provide more instruction for what I'm teaching. So then lastly, EdTPA Central Focus. So I actually pulled this information right off of allocation.com, and I actually liked because it explained the purpose of the central focus and what it should be described in task 1 on the EdTPA. So the first part is your central focus needs to explain or describe what are you teaching your students. So what is the content? So right now I'm teaching the beginning of World War II. So I would describe that I'm teaching the beginning of World War II. Number 2 is the purpose of teaching this content. So I also need to describe in my central focus, why am I teaching World War II? Why is it relevant? Why do they need to know? So I need to be able to explain that as well. And then number 3 is how the implemented standards or planned learning objectives apply to a learning strategy that you used, any skills that are required during the lesson, and any content area connections. So I need to be able to relate the standards back to my learning strategy. So for instance, part of the standards is for World War II is understanding the events of the beginning of World War II. So I'm using a timeline activity so students can understand this and obtain their objective. And lastly, how this lesson plan will work with other lesson plans in a unit to help students make these connections between the skills they develop and your essential strategy. So this is important, or this is where the big idea or focusing on a main idea for a unit comes into play. So for instance, our inquiry question for World War II right now is, when is war ever justified? So by linking all my lesson plans back to that focal question or inquiry question helps kind of unify my entire lesson in my unit and makes everything it makes the information that we've learned so much of the information that we've learned kind of come back to one big idea. So that way it's more understanding. Like the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Okay, U.S. entered World War II then. So that way, that is when war was justified because we were bombed. So kind of making connections like that. But yeah, so that pretty much concludes my presentation on effective instruction in regards to social science and history. Thank you.